Hello, my wonderful third graders. I hope you're having a fantastic day. This is our last lesson for colonial America. I know it's crazy, right? And this will probably be our last ed puzzle for a while, so you may rejoice. Today we're doing part 2 of The Road to Revolution. Some vocabulary you will hear throughout the read aloud. Boycott means to refuse to buy, to reject, or prohibit something. Horrified means frightened or shocked. Independence means freedom, the state of not being controlled by or dependent upon another entity or person. Intolerable means not able to be tolerated, endured, or experienced. It was intolerable. I couldn't take it. Issues are problems, difficulties, obstacles, or disagreements. Repeal means to cancel or take back, to get rid of. Tension means pressure, worry, stress, or nervousness. Unjust means unfair, not right. What have we already learned? The three conflicts between the Native Americans and colonists over land were called the King Philip's War, the Pontiac's Rebellion, and the French and Indian War. Who won these conflicts? The English won the first war against the Wampanoag. The Native Americans managed to keep the colonists away from their land for a time after the 13 colonies groups fought them in the Second War. The French and Indian War occurred after the 13 colonies were established. Who fought in the French and Indian War? The English, the French, and the Native American groups. And there were Native Americans on both sides with the English and the French. What were the three acts passed by Parliament that taxed the colonists? The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Quartering Act. And we're going to learn more today about what those acts led the people to do. And they were passed so Britain could raise money to pay their war debts. As you have heard, the colonists were in strong opposition to the taxes Great Britain kept heaping on them. Their famous words were, "No taxation without representation." One man in particular, Patrick Henry, began to speak up. Patrick Henry was a Virginia lawyer. In Williamsburg, Virginia, he stood before the House of Burgesses and spoke out, against the king and the new tax. Patrick Henry stated that only colonial governments should have the power to introduce new taxes in the colonies. In 1765, the 27 elected leaders of 9 colonies made their way to New York. They met to discuss what could be done about the Stamp Act. This meeting became known as the Stamp Act Congress. Members of the Congress informed the British Parliament that this tax was unjust. Virginia, New Hampshire, North Carolina, and Georgia did not send delegates or representatives. They probably weren't very sure that they wanted to be a part of going against England. Unjust means unfair. Another outspoken leader at this time was a man named Samuel Adams from Massachusetts. He organized a group of people who became known as the Sons of Liberty. These men protested in the streets, burned the stamps, and threatened the agents whose job it was to collect the taxes. It soon became impossible to impose the Stamp Act, and so in 1766 the British Parliament was forced to repeal it. It means they got rid of it. When the colonists heard this news, they celebrated in victory. Yeah, we did it! Woohoo! It worked. Wonder what else they're going to try. Members of Parliament were not happy. King George insisted that it was Britain's right to tax the colonies. A new plan was needed. This time, a man named Charles Townshend had another idea. They would put a tax on items that they knew the colonists really needed. These items, which were used daily in colonial times to make many things, included paint, paper, glass, lead, tea, wool, and silk. In response, the colonists decided to boycott these items from Britain. So a boycott means to refuse to buy. So they wouldn't buy these items from Britain. They'd buy them from other countries. They began to make their own products, or they make their own products. Colonists purchased teas from other sources or drank Liberty tea made from herbs and berries. Many women even began making their own cloth. This hurt British manufacturers, and before long, this tax was also removed. That is, all except for the tax on tea. They drank a lot of tea back then. So the colonists' boycott of British tea continued. Alarmed by the level of protest, the Britons sent troops to the colonies. They arrived in Boston Harbor in 1768. The colonists did not like the presence of British soldiers, especially because the soldiers had been sent to control them. Tension between the colonists and Britain continued to grow. Tension means strong feelings of distress. In 1770, a scuffle or brief fight broke out in Boston between British soldiers and a group of colonists. In the confusion, British soldiers fired their guns into the crowd and killed 5 colonists, injuring 6 others. The first to die was a man named Crispus Attucks. People were horrified. The soldiers were immediately arrested. This terrible event became known as the Boston Massacre. The relationship between the colonists and Britain was becoming much worse. Historians believe Crispus Attucks was an escaped slave. After his death, Attucks became a hero for standing up for what he believed in. It would not be fair to say that tea caused the American Revolution, but it played a part. The colonists were still refusing to buy tea from Britain, and King George and his government were refusing to listen to the colonists. In 1773, the British Parliament introduced a new law called the Tea Act. This time they said that only the British East India Company could sell tea to the colonies, and the tea would still be taxed. This is going to make them mad. The colonists responded that not only did they not want this tea, they didn't want trade ships bringing it into the colonies either. In other words, they would give up drinking British tea altogether. And they used to have like tea time. Like every day they would have, like twice a day, they would just drink tea. In 1773, 3 British trade ships loaded with tea appeared in the Boston Harbor. The Sons of Liberty took action. Wearing elements of Native American war clothing, they threw all of the tea into the water. This event became known as the Boston Tea Party. It is important to point out that colonists didn't intend to disguise themselves as Native Americans. Historians believe that colonists were inspired by the tradition of Native American pride and were dressed in Indian-style regalia to make a statement. But do you think people may have suspected that Native Americans did it at first? Remember the Boston Tea Party, it's very important. Now the king was really mad. You could say the colonists' actions spoke louder than their words. The British government decided to punish this colony. A British general was placed in control of Massachusetts. Boston Harbor was closed, and more British soldiers were sent to Boston. With the port closed, many colonial businesses began to suffer. The colonists called these recent British decisions the intolerable acts because they were not willing to put up with them. If something is intolerable, it means it's not accepted. You can't do it. Maybe your teacher said to you, that behavior is intolerable. I will not accept it. You cannot do it in this classroom. Rather than back down, the colonists began to join together. Many colonists were even more convinced now that the British did not understand them or care about them. Colonists were now daring to think about and talk about establishing their independence from England and becoming their own nation. Those who wanted to become independent or free of England were called patriots. People still loyal to England and the king were known as loyalists. What is independence? Freedom from the control of or reliance upon someone or something else. We wanted our independence from Britain, from England. It was clear that the colonists' relationship with Britain was changing, and elected leaders of the colonies had to decide what to do. George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Ben Franklin, John Hancock, and other leaders came together for a gathering in Philadelphia known as the First Continental Congress. Ooh, this is important American history. In this meeting, the leaders voted to end all trade with Britain until Britain repealed the Intolerable Acts. Most people still hoped that these issues could be resolved peacefully. However, it was decided that each colony should begin to store weapons and train men for war. Do you recognize any of these men? The first four were the first U.S. presidents: Washington, Madison, who was it? Yeah, Madison and Thomas Jefferson. Oh, sorry. Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Madison were the first four presidents. They are all known today as the Founding Fathers for their part in establishing America's independence. Very important men. Again, that's George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, and John Hancock. On April 18, 1775, British soldiers were given information about colonial weapons that had been secretly stored in a town called Concord, about 20 miles from Boston. The soldiers were ordered to seize the weapons and destroy them. The British soldiers began to march towards Concord. A colonist named Paul Revere rode through the night to inform his fellow patriots that the British were coming. Perhaps you are familiar with this first part of a famous poem called Paul Revere's Ride by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, based on this historic event. It's a very famous poem. Listen, my children, as you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere on the 18th of April in 75. Hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. He said to his friend, if the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the north church tower as a signal light. One if by land and two if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be. Paul Revere saw the signal of two lanterns lit by his friend in the church tower. That meant the British were coming by sea, so he rode all night to Concord to warn the colonists. Although Paul Revere was captured, the colonial soldiers, called Minutemen, were warned and prepared for the arrival of the British. The very first shots of the American War were fired in Lexington on April 19, 1775, as the British soldiers were on their way to Concord. Historians are not certain who fired the first shot. Several Minutemen died in this exchange of fire. The British soldiers continued their march towards Concord. However, when they got there, the weapons were nowhere to be found. Paul Revere's historic ride had warned the colonists in time for them to move their weapons. The British began to retreat. As they did, they were fired upon by Minutemen. Many British soldiers were killed. This was later called the shot heard round the world, in a famous poem written by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Why do you think it was called that? It had a very big impact around the world. So even though it happened in North America, what happened affected many people in the world. It started the American Revolution. So here's Concord Hymn by Ralph Waldo Emerson, sung at the completion of the Battle Monument in 1837. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled, Here once the embattled farmers stood, and fired the shot heard round the world. The foe long since in silence slept, alike the conqueror silent sleeps. In time the ruined bridge has swept down the dark stream which seaward creeps. On this green bank by this soft stream we set today, a votive stone, that memory may their deed redeem, when like our sires our sons are gone. Spirit that made these heroes dare to die and leave their children free, bid time and nature gently spare the shaft we raised to them in thee. A second gathering of leaders from each colony was called in the city of Philadelphia, which would be later become the first capital of the United States. Shortly before this meeting, Patrick Henry had uttered these famous words: "I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." At this Second Continental Congress, George Washington was chosen to be the commander-in-chief, in charge of an army that did not yet fully exist, but which the leaders anticipated they would soon need. Washington would not become president until many years later. Today, the role of commander-in-chief is also fulfilled by the U.S. president. During this time, many letters and petitions were sent to King George. Among them was the Declaration of Independence, primarily penned by Thomas Jefferson and approved by the Founding Fathers on July 4, 1776. King George responded by ignoring the colonists' requests and sending more British soldiers to the colonies. Oh, King George. The long and difficult battle for America's independence had begun. Independence. The first American flag, known as the Stars and Stripes, was adopted in 1777. The colonists no longer wanted to fly the British flag. They wanted their own flag. Which outspoken patriot did you hear about who was a lawyer from Virginia? Patrick Henry. What did he do, and what famous quote is he known for today? He spoke out against what many colonists felt were Britain's unjust and intolerable acts by standing behind the saying, "No taxation without representation." He is also known for saying, "Give me liberty or give me death." And then the British actually did kill him. You heard about another patriot, Samuel Adams. What was the name of the group of patriots he organized? The Sons of Liberty. Why did the colonists boycott products from Britain such as tea, wool, paper, and silk? Because Britain was taxing the colonists on these items, the colonists refused to buy them. Describe what is happening in this image. The Sons of Liberty dressed up in part like Native Americans and dumped British tea into the Boston Harbor, an event known today as the Boston Tea Party. Why did they do this? What in the world? These patriots were not only boycotting the tea, they were also sending a message with their act of destroying the tea that they would not tolerate the injustice of the British taxes. Describe what is happening in this image and explain how the saying "one if by land or two if by sea" is related. Paul Revere rode through the night to warn colonists at Concord that the British were coming to seize their weapons. Later, this line became part of a famous poem based on this event called Paul Revere's Ride, right? So he asked his friend to put one lantern in the window if they came by land and two if the British came by sea. What was the significance of Paul Revere's Ride? Why was it so important? Although Revere was captured, he was first able to warn the colonists, who then removed their weapons and kept the British from taking them. Good job, Paul Revere. Explain the meaning of the saying, "the shot heard round the world." This was a line from a poem written years later about this event. The first shot that was fired that started the American Revolution had far-reaching impacts upon all of history in the world. It was just the beginning of a lot of things that were changing. Who were some of the colonial leaders who met in the Continental Congress and who are known today as founding fathers? George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Patrick Henry, Benjamin Franklin, and John Hancock. Which of these was appointed commander-in-chief of the colonial army and later became the first U.S. president? George Washington. And the Founding Fathers approved the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. That is why we celebrate July 4th as Independence Day. And this document signified that the colonists wanted to be free of Britain to create their own country. Yay, the starting of the United States of America. Our word for today is independence. In the read aloud you heard, colonists were now daring to think about and talk about establishing their independence from England and becoming their own nation. Say the word independence. Independence is the freedom from the control of or reliance upon someone or something. When children grow up and move out of their childhood home, they establish a certain level of independence from their parents or guardians as they learn how to provide for themselves. So we talked about the saying, actions speak louder than words. So literally that it means exactly what it says, right? But actions speak louder than words is usually used figuratively. It means that when you show something, when you do something, it can have a bigger impact than just saying something. So if you love somebody, if you show them that by taking care of them and maybe giving them presents and spending time with them, they're going to realize it more than if you just say, I love you. It can be more important. All right, third graders. We have done it. We've gotten to the American Revolution. Our colonial period is almost over. No more 13 colonies. We're going to start making states and becoming the United States of America. This is exciting.